For people that don't know you, do you want to say how long you've been working for the DA's office?
Oh, for sure. I've been there for over 20 years. So I started in 2001. It was my first out of law school job, and I've been
Oh,
there
right into the
since.
office. Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Oh,
Yeah.
that's cool. Did you know that's what you wanted to do when you got into law?
Not at all.
No.
Yeah, no. I'm actually from Humboldt County,
Oh,
and
okay.
so I thought I wanted to go into more like land use, environmental, sort of make things work, for folks, bring everyone together, see how we could kind of meet in the middle, because I just always saw that sort of conflict, between the use of resources and wanting to, respect our environment and all of that. So I thought I was going to do that type of law and more transactional. And I also focus on international law as well during law
Okay.
school. Everyone in law school has to take like criminal law and constitutional law, criminal procedure, evidence. Those are kind of basic core classes, which of course I took, and I really liked them and loved it. And then I knew after law school that I wanted to try to come back to Humboldt County and begin a career. And so I interviewed at a few different private firms, and then I also interviewed at the DA's office. And it was with Terry Farmer. He was the DA at the time. And Maggie Fleming was one of the senior prosecutors, along with Worth Dykeman, Rob Boyd, Max Cardoza. And so I was interviewed by kind of a group of senior prosecutors. And I think it was that afternoon that Terry made the call to me and offered me the position. Which wouldn't have begun, for like a month and a half later. So I started interning at the office to sort of learn the job. But I had no plans to be a trial lawyer whatsoever. That didn't seem to be something that would fit with my nature. But it's been the perfect fit. And I just can't imagine, doing anything
Oh, how funny
different.
is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, environmental law to criminal law is kind of a big turn, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. I studied biological sciences. So I have a BS in bio from Davis. So I
Okay.
have a
Oh, that's where you did your undergrad was Davis.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. So
nice.
I have a little bit of a different background than most criminal lawyers.
Wow.
Yeah.
And never looked back. Got in at the DA's office and just, it fit perfectly.
Yeah, it really did. I love my work. And I think that having the first year or so, I did kind of just general misdemeanors like most folks do when they begin a DA's office. And then I quickly transitioned into the juvenile justice program. So that I was the only prosecutor handling those cases. And so I was able to gain a lot of exposure to all different types of crimes, and then also work with a lot of other entities, the probation department really closely, child welfare services, service providers, and then the courts. And it's a little more of an intimate court setting. It's confidential, so it's kind of the closed courtroom. But then also I got to work very closely with victims and help to remind the court and all the parties that there's more to the what's happened here than just the interests of the offending youth, but also being a voice for the victims. So that was really rewarding early on, and also gave me this great opportunity to kind of delve into the issues that kind of rise to the level, making it so some kids are higher risk of going into the criminal lifestyle, if you will, and just to learn a lot more about what happens behind closed doors in some of the homes here in Humboldt County, and a lot of the challenges that our youth face, and also getting to see a lot of kids that kind of rose beyond that, and were able to get some skills that allowed them to move on, and some go to college, and just have these tremendous accomplishments. Of course, not every story is a success story, but
Yeah, unfortunately, right?
each one that we had, it was like you just really wanted to hold on to that. And so I remember quite a few of those. And
That was your first year you were working on juvenile cases?
that was like shortly after, about a year into
Into
my
it.
career. So I
Okay.
did that for about 13 years. I did it for a long time.
That's got to be
Yeah.
hard working with juveniles, doing that and prosecuting those cases.
Yeah, a lot of it was hard. I mean, there was a lot of, tragedy and trauma, that you're exposed to just
Mm-hmm.
being in the system, and the court really would delve into the lives of the juvenile. And so we learned a lot about, who their care providers were or weren't, and abuse history, substance abuse, whether their parents might be incarcerated, uh, maybe their parents, were deceased. A lot of tragedy that's in
Mm-hmm.
the lives of some of these young folks. Not all, there were some offenders that just made bad mistakes, and they're, just and had pretty, healthy home environments. That happens, of course, as well. Um, but it was just a really great opportunity to sort of see the reality of the challenges that a lot of people face, and to be able to take those into consideration and figuring out how to address these circumstances to help prevent, the criminal conduct from occurring again, enhancing public safety, and also, get the kid on the right track, get them in school. When I grew up here, I thought like continuation school, and when kids got in trouble, that, oh my gosh, they must be having to go to school like at 6 a.m. until like 9 p.m. or something crazy like that, because they're
Yeah.
really in for it now. And then I learned it was quite the opposite. It's like the schools weren't able to address their behaviors, and so it sort of resulted in the kids having absolutely no supervision and potentially being out on the streets. And
Are a lot of those kids, when they get into the system like that, do they end up being repeat offenders? So it's one crime and then it leads down that path of just continuation.
I don't know exactly that I would say a lot, but certainly there were young people that graduated into the adult system, and some of the crimes were also very serious, just as serious as adult offenders in terms of the underlying conduct. I mean, my first homicide was two young men that killed a homeless man,
Oh,
and
wow.
so and I also had a number of sexual assault, sexual molestation cases. So older kids sexually assaulting younger children. Most of my trials that I remember that I had in juvenile court, many of them involve sexual assault allegations and charges. Also, I had a lot of, like fights at school, or, kind of assault with a deadly weapon type cases, burglaries, things like that. But the child molestation charges and those happen, and oftentimes those are more contested. And so it makes a lot of sense that those would be the ones that would go to trial. But
That is not what I was. That's not what came to mind when you said juvenile cases. I was thinking petty theft or fights or, these smaller crimes. You don't think
yeah.
of homicide and sexual assault as fitting in to, kids committing these crimes.
Right, right. So all of the cases that a law enforcement officer would write a report on, those first go to the juvenile probation department, and then they would go from there to the district attorney's office, and I would then review them. And so there was this whole filtering process. So officers out on the street might use some degree of discretion in terms of how they handle the incident. And then if it's a little more, higher level of seriousness, then it might go to the probation department. And then they had a lot of discretion as well in terms of what charges they would then refer to the district attorney's office. So what ended up on my desk was typically the more serious offenses, or kids that just were
Repeat
repeat
offenders.
offenders, I guess. I would call them different terms. But
What would you call them?
I don't necessarily even like using the word offenders, and it's like a whole different terminology for kids. That we don't even say it's criminal. It's more like, behavior that would be criminal conduct because it's just sort of this movement to like not like criminalize kids, but sometimes it's sort of a bit counterintuitive, because maybe it's the behavior that's really at issue and not how the adults in charge respond to it, which was sort of a rub for me in my later years, actually, of working in the juvenile justice system, because fewer and fewer kids were even going through the system, not because they weren't engaging in the same kind of criminal conduct, but because sort of the trend, based upon studies and evidence-based research, that it was better to not immerse them in the system, maybe because you might expose one child to a more serious offender, but it was a little problematic in my mind that kids might, engage in criminal conduct and then nothing would happen, because they might not be having any sort of consequences
Yeah,
in
there are
the
no
home,
repercussions for the
no
actions.
repercussions, nothing. The school's hands are tied oftentimes, and so I think accountability is really important, and I think consistency is really important. I think those concepts certainly are applicable to helping our youth, find boundaries and sort of help them understand, our social norms and, how we can respect one another, basically,
Has that continued, that decline in, wanting to use this safe language around juveniles and not wanting them to go into the system depending on the crime, or has that continued or furthered, I guess, or has there been pushback on that?
It's continued, I would say, probably even further. So when I first started in the juvenile justice program, there was the California Youth Authority, which was basically prison for kids. And so it had,
That would be like juvenile hall.
well,
Or
it's more, so juvenile hall would be the equivalent of like the county jail.
okay.
So, but kids wouldn't be there in theory for a long-term period. But California Youth Authority was for all counties of juvenile offenders, for like the more serious offenders or offenders where all of the county resources had been exhausted. So the county had tried to address the behavior of the youth, try to provide services, whatever intervention the county might have available to them. And if that didn't prove to help the child change their behavior, then they might ultimately be committed to the California Youth Authority.
Okay.
And or back in the day, it might have been because of the underlying offense. So homicide, if they weren't tried as an adult, then maybe they would be committed to California Youth Authority, or under some circumstance. It gets complicated.
Yeah.
But so I'll stop.
No. It's interesting hearing that thought process, right? Because there's really two camps. The camp of, you need to hold these kids accountable so that they don't think that these actions are okay, right? And continue down that path. But you almost want to take into account that they're just kids. And sometimes you're a product of your environment. You don't want to ruin a kid's life because of a mistake they might have made when they were 13 or 14.
Right. And I think that maybe the better approach is taking all of those concepts together, and so, but, back to like kind of the trend. So I did have the California Youth Authority. Then there were things that happened there that, were objectionable, and there were lawsuits, and there were a lot of changes that were made and a lot of reform within that system. And, fast forward to where we're at today, basically the California Youth Authority, that it then changed its name to Division of Juvenile Justice, I think. That's the top of my head. I might have that wrong. DJJ. But it's now essentially closing. So that's no longer an option for counties where, and it can be particularly challenging for the more rural, smaller counties where there's limited resources, but maybe just as serious of offenders in terms of how they can help, wrap around those services. So now it's been transitioned, so it's back to the counties having the ultimate responsibility for juvenile offenders. And the laws have also changed as well, reducing the amount of discretion in situations where the district attorney's office can file on juvenile offenders and treat them as if they were adults. So that's extremely limited and much lower possibility. And basically, it's always going to be up to to oversimplify, now totally be in the hands of the court if we petition them and if certain circumstances apply. So age and type of offense.
I was going to say, is that an age
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And severity of crime and things like that. Okay.
Yeah. So it's a very small group of juveniles that potentially could even be eligible for those types of commitments. And again, it's no longer a state operated facility.
It's up to the court to decide things like that.
Yeah, the court to decide, and then there won't be the prison for kids. That's just gone. Basically, is what's happening.
Does that result in longer stays at?
So juvenile hall will become
situations like that.
So the county has to, and the county's been working on that, and the probation department really to have the appropriate services and sort of a program that would be available to offenders that historically would have been sent, to the California Youth Authority. years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a whole different process, and at the end of the day, always kind of keeping the offenders local is what's happening.
Have you noticed more juveniles are inclined to offend again because now there's not that next tier of, okay, we're going to send you to this place because your actions are indicative that this is becoming a pattern?
Yeah, so that's a really good question that I don't know the answer to,
Mm-hmm.
like whether the actual, you know, type of conduct that we would call crimes if they were adults, whether that's increased in light of the different type of a response by the probation department, and I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is, like from my experience and when I was doing the juvenile justice cases, is that even though I was the one that was, we need to have consequences here, you violated your term of probation, or, I expect X, Y, and Z to happen. And even if I was saying to the juvenile offenders, like, okay, we're going to give you a chance, you can, return home on house arrest rather than spend another, 4 weeks at juvenile hall. This is just for example.
Mm-hmm.
And, but if you violate your terms again, I'm going to ask for that 4 weeks at juvenile hall the next time you come back. And I would make note of that, and I would follow through. Likewise, so if the kid did violate, I would ask for the 4 weeks in juvenile hall. But if the child did not, and they did well, I was more than happy to commend them for that as well. So, and I would get feedback oftentimes because I was there for so long. They really appreciated like the consistency, and they knew what I was going to say, and the kids would kind of peek over, and I have long-lasting relationships with a lot of the defense attorneys that also worked in the juvenile justice system and the probation officers, and so we kind of all knew what our roles were and worked together for that common goal of trying to serve the best interests of the juvenile, and and then I have to look out for the protection of the community and
Mm-hmm.
ensure that the victims have a voice.
Was it hard prosecuting those cases in the sense that you had a first-hand experience of seeing what kids are capable of? I mean, I feel like it's different when you see it from adults because you recognize that adults are capable of extreme acts of violence or of these sexual acts. But when you see it from a kid, it's gotta have a little different kick to it, I would imagine.
Absolutely. And and again, I think what helped in terms of how I dealt with that, like on a personal level, of course, it's really important to have really good boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
in all of this. But knowing that sometimes that intervention through the court, would get attention for that particular child and hopefully get, oftentimes, these kids weren't going to school, or, there were other issues beyond whatever the criminal conduct was. And I think that helped me deal with the overall situation as well, just kind of knowing that we're all here to serve their best interests, and maybe there will be services in place that can kind of help the family as a whole. But yeah, it was hard at times to look over and see, kids, and one of my colleagues would always reference this. It was like, yep, his feet didn't even touch the floor. So it's like their little legs just swinging,
That is crazy.
But, I recall, I think the youngest age I ever filed any charges, and this is, were these two little boys who were in a school field during the weekend, unsupervised, and it turns out that they had attempted to break into a classroom, and they were going to break into the classroom so they could kill the hamster, and they were then burning each other's hair out in the field, and they had lighters. And so how many red flags, do you need? And what I do remember is, of those two boys, when, he was arraigned on his charges, and there was some intervention, and he never came back. The other little boy, he had, reoccurring incidences and challenges throughout the rest of his life. So, and it was fine. Nobody hurt them, but it was important that folks take a good look at what was happening for those two boys. So, but yeah, it was
Wow.
hard.
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
imagine. I would imagine it had a very big impact on your career, especially where, you walked in and that's where you started. Is that common? Um, do most lawyers that go into the DA, do they start with juvenile cases as a way to kind of build up?
No, lots of people, it depends on the office, but lots of folks are able to kind of have their entire career without doing the juvenile justice portion. And it's not really the place for everyone. I think that it's sort of a unique area of practice for prosecutors, in part because there isn't that. Out in the public, you're not, I didn't have juries. It was really with the courts and the families and, the defense attorneys. And it's kind of a little, it's its own little world, if you will. And, but I think it's really good and important exposure for all. And it is a little bit unusual to do it for as long as I did it. I loved it. And one of the careers that I considered, of course, was, going into teaching and working with kids. And so even after I came out of the juvenile justice program, I came out and I did general felonies for about a year. And but then I quickly transitioned and was assigned to sexual assault unit and the child abuse cases. So, and I've been doing those since. So I've almost throughout the totality of my career have had kind of protection of children as a key component to my career. And that's just been, very rewarding for me. But again, I don't think it's for everyone because it is really tough. It is
I
very
would
tough.
imagine you would have to maintain a certain temperament in that because it would become very easy to be jaded seeing all of those cases, especially sexual assault cases, right? And just seeing that and having to deal with like these are the only cases you're getting, that would be a hard pill to swallow.
Yes, it's
I mean, in the sense that it could break you down seeing that side of humanity repeatedly like that.
yeah. And, vicarious trauma is a real thing, as you're exposed more and more to other people's trauma and tragedy, that can have an impact, on folks that try to be aware of that. And yeah, so I mean, I don't kid myself. There's a cost to it, but at the same time, there's a tremendous reward as well, because I have had the opportunity to follow, have cases where we were able to prosecute and we were able to, take it the whole way and hold the offender, appropriately accountable for the conduct, empower the victim, give them a sense of justice. And really it's freedom. Really, that's what they get, and to know that, oh, this isn't my responsibility. That was that other person that did this to me, and they don't get to do that anymore. And they don't get to do it anymore because I'm standing up for myself and I'm letting everyone know exactly what they did and how it wasn't okay. And they take charge, right? And to just see that growth and to see, these kids, find a sense of empowerment and a sense of safety and just move on with their lives. It's, oh, wow.
Incredibly rewarding.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's insane. I mean, it is a very important job because somebody has to do that, right? You don't want repeat offenders, especially out on the street. And ideally, you would want to stop people before they could get there, but we don't have that magic solution yet. But to give back to the victims and say, yes, there is justice, and yes, we can help you try to move forward from what happened. I think that is incredibly important. That's a story that is always uplifting when someone that did something wrong does have to own up to what they did and pay for that by whatever extent that measures up to.
Right. And I think as well with, in particular, sexual assault cases, it's so important when survivors are able to come forward and share their experience. Not always, and oftentimes it just doesn't land itself where we are able to prosecute the case. They're super hard to prove. But when a survivor is able to come forward and share their experience, it makes it that much easier in the event that there's another victim or some other incident that's happened, because sometimes we're able to piece those together and build a stronger case. So I, for example, one of my last jury trials involved an offender, Michael Flores, who he was paroled to Humboldt County after being released following convictions and having been sentenced to serve a 50-year sentence for sexual molestation of his stepdaughters, as well as the attempted murder of his then wife, who was the mother of the children he victimized. Crazy story. The little girls back in the day shared with their mom why they were having some troubles, and disclosed, that he had been abusing them. And he, while the mom was having the conversation with her little girls, he was on the other side of a door listening. So when the mom opened the door, he was there listening. And she, close in time, ended up going to law enforcement, making the report. He went on the run. She went back to the family home to get some of her belongings, and he had snuck back into the home and was hiding behind the door. So when she came through the front door, he struck her on the back of the head, knocked her unconscious, and then she went in and out of consciousness and enough that she recalled his dragging her back into a bedroom. And then, and he all the while was telling her many horrific things that he was going to do to her. He then put lighter fluid or gasoline throughout the house and ended up lighting the house on fire, leaving her on the bed semi-unconscious. And but she awoke and was able to crawl, and she crawled out a window and escaped from the burning house and to the neighbors. And the neighbors then called the police, and then there was a really massive manhunt, and they ended up finding him. The woman that he had left in the burning house, she survived, and her daughters also survived, but they lived in terror. And when he was released from prison and paroled after serving just around half of his 50-year sentence, they had reached out because they were still quite afraid of him. And Mr. Flowers then reoffended, and he raped a young woman who was in her 20s and who had her own life struggles. She had a little girl of her own and was somewhat transient and probably struggled with some addiction issues. And she was essentially sold to Mr. Flowers against her will. And he brutally raped her. And the Rio Dale Police Department got word that this had happened, and they reached out and were able to get enough trust of this, 20-something-year-old young woman. And so we were able to file charges and able to give her enough support that she was able to get through the whole trial process, and she testified. And the little girls that he had sexually abused, nearly 30 years earlier, they testified during the trial. So that's just a really good example of how earlier reports or earlier incidences can become very significant, during the course in our ability to prove more recent incidences. And it might be that if the jurors hadn't had the opportunity to hear about Mr. Flowers' history of, frankly, it was rape. He raped those little girls, that they might not have found the case to have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt for the more recent rape, in part, with this young woman having, some life challenges that, and it might have been more his word versus her word type of a situation. So I just really want to applaud all survivors that are brave enough to come forward and work with law enforcement and work with us. And I do acknowledge that we're not always able to proceed, in the moment on charges, but it's just so very important that people are able to do that and come forward.
Is that hard for you to hear about cases like that, especially where somebody commits a horrendous crime and then maybe goes away for a small amount of time and then comes back out and does something else. And you're like, we put this guy away for that reason because we knew something like this would happen again, and he got out. And then, especially, you hear about all the releases from like the county jail where we just don't have enough room, so people are getting released, and then they commit a crime, and then they go right back in, and then that cycle just continues. Is that hard for you
Yes.
as a prosecutor to hear that?
Yes, it's extremely hard. And for that Flowers example, I will never understand the math. I do not understand and will never understand how he was sentenced to 50 years and just around 25 years he's back out on the streets. That makes absolutely no sense to me. There are scenarios where other types of offenses, folks are given, day for day credit. So a 3-year sentence really is a year and a half. And then, like with COVID, there were all of these other, early release. And so, it's really hard. And I have, sexual molestation child victims where part of the reason we'll enter into plea agreements short of going to trial is to, spare them of the potential trauma of going through and having to testify about horrific acts and sometimes, very personal acts and things, that,
You don't really want to rehash
you don't
in
want to
public.
rehash in public. And I mean, it's just,
Understandable.
right.
Completely.
Very, very much so. And so that's one of the advantages. And then also the sense of like, okay, if we reach this agreement, we know what will happen. Whereas if we go to jury trial, no matter how strong of a case, there's always some risk that, not all convictions will be sustained. And then we don't know how the judge, sometimes, it's mandated by law, but we don't know exactly what the sentence might be. So there's some degree of risk. And also it's, often beneficial to have an earlier resolution. And so one of the things that we oftentimes talk with, in particular child victims, is, well, where do we want to have you in your life, when this person might re-enter the community? That's something we'll discuss. And, oftentimes the kids, they want to be adults. They want to be, okay, I would be about in college by then. So that's part of, the calculation if we're going to come up with some sort of determinate term, like specific number. And this is a discussion where, say, if an offender might be looking at a life sentence or, a high exposure. And okay, so we've had those discussions, and then maybe there's an agreement that's reached and everyone is at peace with it, and it's, a just resolution, and the offender's, sent off to prison. I have more than one case where, the mom of the victim or survivor, they'll look every single day. What's the earliest parole release date?
Oh, just checking the status for it.
Mm-hmm. And then, with the COVID and some of the other changes and sort of release protocols, they've, the board of parole, different changes, those numbers, were declining. And that's something that historically we wouldn't have seen, particularly with child molest cases. And that just breaks my heart, to think of being a mom. It's like, oh, well, I thought my daughter would be, 25 when he was going to get out. And now, she might only be, 23 or, something like that. And I don't know that the general public, appreciates that, what some of these families go through. And it's, yeah.
Well, you can empathize, but to put yourself in that position is something that is near impossible until you're actually in that situation. I think you can you can see it from an outside perspective and recognize, oh my God, it's horrible, and I can't imagine how you're feeling, but you really can't imagine how they're feeling, even if you try to. I think that's just so detached from most people's lives until you're thrust into that situation of, oh, this actually happened now, and this is where we are, and this is our reality. But do you think that that's just, is that a knock on the system? Is the system falling apart for those victims, or is it just?
Oh, I think that's a system failure. I think that, that's when they're told a number and we're told a number and that's what the laws say, I think that's how long that individual should be serving time for. Yeah.
And had those sentences been getting reduced prior to COVID, or did COVID really exacerbate that?
I think COVID exacerbated it to a certain extent, and I think that, and then it just kind of depends a little bit on the who's making those decisions and sort of the priorities.
Who gets the ultimate say in that? Is it the judge that handled the case, or is there a
Well,
board that oversees?
yeah, so the governor can make changes. There can be board of parole decisions. The warden, so once the individual's sent to prison and has been sentenced to a certain extent, the sentencing court, loses jurisdiction, if you will, over how that time is actually served. But historically, for more serious violent offenses, those sentences, will be served as is. But then there can be certain special circumstances and, emergency legislation and, that can end up causing some earlier releases. And we saw a lot of that recently. There's been a tremendous trend, for lower levels of incarceration of folks, and sometimes that can be appropriate.
Yeah, if it's a drug, somebody was dealing weed, I would understand that they would get released. But lower level, I would consider like child molestation. I would not consider that lower level.
No.
So you hear about them reducing those charges, and it's like, well, okay, now is that really lower level? I mean, should we?
No.
Yeah, right?
I'll answer that.
Yeah, it's not.
So,
Do you get frustrated with that? Because I'm over here and I'm listening to that and I'm frustrated.
Of course I get frustrated. And that's why I think it's really important to have people, continuing to fight against that, and so it's like, just because other decision makers are leaning one way, it doesn't mean we don't continue to fight and continue to make our voice heard. We're not always going to get what we want, but we have to stand up for what's right.
In the case of that child molestation case where he only served 25 of the 50, is 25 in that case, was 25 the minimum that he had to, or that's just
I don't even know how that happened.
Mm-hmm.
That just like I say, I don't understand that. Nobody could explain it.
It's pretty crazy hearing that.
Yeah, and nobody could explain it to the victims. I doubt that the prosecutor that entered into that agreement, years past in an entirely different county, I bet that prosecutor would never have guessed that would have happened. But, it might have been related to Mr. Flores. He was getting older, but obviously not too old to rape again.
That is so crazy. And of a 50-year sentence to only have to serve half.
Yeah.
For something that severe.
Yeah.
In the first place is kind of outrageous.
Yes.
Wow. When you hear that, especially from an outside perspective like mine, obviously I'm not in your world, thankfully, or at least not on the receiving end, thankfully, I should say. But it almost degrades your faith in the system a little bit. You hear that and you're like, well, how is that justice? How is that helping anybody? And I mean, I have my own gripes with the prison system as a whole. I don't think it's structured around rehabilitation. I think it's
right.
Structured around punishment. You did the crime and now we're going to punish you until we deem your punishment has been enough such that you can be released. And I have my own, that is a whole other ballgame.
Yeah.
But if you do something like that, I mean, there has to be a consequence. And to not have to serve your consequence, well then what are we doing? What is the point of any of that? And so I can only imagine being that child or being one of the parents of that child and then kind of getting slapped in the face with that would just be just be unimaginable.
Yeah. On top of the fact that they truly lived in fear.
Yeah.
I mean,
On top of what happened,
right.
and then yeah.
They truly believed he would try to find them and kill them. Legitimately so, you know. That's a
I would imagine those are the kind of cases that keep you up at night when it comes back to that, and you're just like, what happened? Where did this all go wrong?
Well, the good news is he's in prison, serving life.
Oh, back now. Okay.
Yeah.
So on a life
because
charge,
he was convicted on
again on that second one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if you get a life conviction, is there any chance of that being reduced?
Well, most life sentences are X number of years to life.
Oh, okay.
And you might be able to be eligible for parole. So, and then that's, the parole board that makes those decisions, looking at all the circumstances, the underlying offense, input from the victims, survivors, as well as, what he or she might have done during their time in prison, whether they're demonstrating remorse, some degree of rehabilitation. There are programs, for folks when they're in prison, and it depends, on where they're housed and what's available and what, resources they take advantage of. I have no doubt that there's a lot of room for improvement in that as well. And I think I probably, I don't know how you feel, but, I can say that I feel that I think it would be, beneficial to have good services and, build, skills and teach empathy and, have those conversations. So ideally, when folks that have served time, when they come back to the community, they're more productive, grounded citizens. How does that not benefit everyone, And hopefully, they will have other opportunities in life other than engaging in criminal conduct, So I think that's kind of a win for all if we put our monies and resources in that direction. And, most that go through the criminal justice system don't find themselves in prison. It really is, a smaller segment of that population of offenders that sadly do need to be removed from society to protect the public.
Yeah, I mean, you want them to. The theory of prison is ideal, where you go away, you do your time, you rehabilitate, and you come out a better person than you went in. That's the theory, right?
Theory, right.
And that's what we all would like to believe happens, and in a perfect world, that would happen. But I think to say that rehabilitation occurs in prison would almost be laughable to some extent. For most of the inmates, I don't think there's any rehabilitation. I think it's survival.
Yeah.
To some extent, and then you just put in your time and you come out, and then you either recommit something and go back in, and then that's your life. Some of them want to go back, which is hard to believe that would be preferable to being out. But I get it, structure, and at least in there you would have your daily routine and you would know what's acceptable and what's not.
Right.
But the idea that we shouldn't be trying to help them is crazy, because we should want everyone to be better. We should want these people to get help so that they don't ever do anything like that again. But that's not
the reality.
Yeah.
And so there's always, but again, I think it's important to not give up,
Yeah.
And
well, if you give up, then it's lost, right?
Yeah. So,
Yeah. I don't know. What do you think about one of the things you hear, and I'm sure it's very infrequent that this occurs, but you hear about in reference to like DAs is it's all about the numbers, right? So you never take a case that you can't win because you want to get your prosecution rate high and things like that. Does that actually occur? I'm not saying that it occurs in your department or anything like that, but have you heard stories of that actually occurring, or is it hard to swallow that, knowing that does occur?
Yeah, it is hard to swallow that, and I've heard of stories of that occurring. And when I hear that, I always think I couldn't have done that. I probably would have changed my career early on if that's what it was about. And it's only now doing running, for a DA that I've had that question presented to me, like, oh, what's your trial record? And it's like, Ooh, wow. Okay, I did not keep trial, because to me it's like it's
That's
a
a good sign. Hearing
win.
you say that is a good
Yeah,
sign.
it's like I'm successful if I've presented all the admissible evidence. I've supported the victims and survivors. I've applied the evidence, the facts to the law, made a good argument to the jurors. Now it's in their hands, and so to me that's a successful prosecution. And justice isn't based on number of convictions by any means. I think that if I were a prosecutor who didn't sustain convictions, then I would have to begin to wonder if I was in the right profession, But yeah, so I didn't keep personally didn't keep records of all of my wins, but I do recall the one time that a judge came back and didn't find, and it was a juvenile case and it was a child molest case. And that was really tragic, because I really believed the little girl who had made a very good disclosure to her mom early on, and just basically adults failed her throughout. And so that I recall that very, very well. And but yeah, it's not about the numbers in my mind. But I think it's, you have to be kind of aware of, if you're consistently losing, there
Yeah,
might be,
that's kind of a warning sign, right? If you're not winning
there might
any
be a
cases,
problem,
yeah.
but yeah, and it's the same. And I don't think you should take cases to trial just because, oh, this is a slam dunk and I'm going to get a win. I mean, I think that would be unethical,
Hmm.
frankly.
With that little girl, was that the case was tossed out by the judge? What was?
Well, it was a little girl who her mom struggled with her own addiction issues, and the mom had taken the little girl, over to a house, and the mom was, I don't know what she was doing, whatever her business she had at that particular house. There was also a teenage boy, older teenager, I think he was about 17, and he had spent time with the little girl, who was about 4 or 5. Hadn't The little girl wasn't yet in kindergarten. And so after being at the house, the little girl told her mom that bad things had happened. And the mom didn't take any action, didn't, make a report to law enforcement. She didn't question anyone or anything. And that was, early in the summer, like May, June-ish. And so a few months passed, and then the mom had to take her daughter for a well child checkup so she could go into kindergarten. And at the well child checkup, the mom asked the doctor to take a look to see if there'd been, and she used very crass language, and the doctor had made note of it in her notes. And the doctor wasn't, a specially trained sexual assault examiner or anything along those lines. And from her perspective, things appeared normal. No indication of abuse, which would be completely consistent with what had happened with the child. We wouldn't expect to see anything. And so the doctor, who had recently come to California from out of state, and I don't recall at the top of my head where she had previously practiced, wasn't aware of the mandated reporting laws that we had in California. And she didn't report it. She should have, based on what the mom had told her. And so a number of months passed again with no action taking place. And the little girl made a disclosure at school close in time to Christmas. And it was just, I think, just before the winter break. And but thankfully, that teacher's aide knew the mandated reporter laws, and a report was made, and that ultimately triggered the law enforcement investigation. The little girl was brought to the Child Abuse Services team forensic interviewing office, and she was interviewed, and she gave a really detailed statement of what had happened to her in the teenage boy's room. And she also gave detail, and what I remember her sharing was that she knew where he kept his, and I think she called it man jelly. And when a search warrant was subsequently served at his residence and in his room, and there was lubricant, like KY jelly, found exactly where the little girl had said it had come from, which corroborated her statement. And there were other things that did as well. One of the things that the interviewer asked, and we don't do this any longer, is that the interviewer asked, how many times did he do this? And she said, oh, millions. Because in her mind, it was that, because he, without
traumatic.
giving you too much detail, but yeah, it was more than once, and a lot more than once, because of what was happening to her. And the court found that statement in particular wasn't credible, and ultimately found that there wasn't enough evidence, to prove the charge beyond a reasonable doubt. I remember during when the little girl was testifying and talking about what had happened to her and describing, and when she meant to say penis, she said peanut, and her mom was in the audience and started laughing. And I remember keeping a smile on my face as I'm directing towards the little girl and walking backwards and leaning down to the mom and having to admonish her based on her behavior as her little girl's testifying about the sexual abuse that she endured. Yeah. So I remember that because the court didn't find that it was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And
primarily based on those two things, that was enough.
Yeah, and I think that if the if the adults in her life had acted in a protective manner, that I think the results would have been different. And because the investigation would have been much earlier in time, there probably would have been findings. And because of the passage of time and the healing of the body, you wouldn't expect to find necessarily
any evidence.
Yeah. So so it's just, so I remember that. But I've had a lot of successes in terms of my prosecutions, and I think that my trial record, why I'm proud of it is not so I can say, oh, I have this many convictions, because that's not really consistent with who I am and what I value. But it's like, wow, those are cases where survivors found their justice, and that's what makes me feel good, proud of them.
Yeah. How old was that girl?
That
little girl.
For that, she was pre-kindergarten, so she was like 4 or 5. Yeah.
Wow.
She was a little.
Did she go back to the mom, or did CPS step in, or?
Child Welfare Services was involved in the life, but her life, but I don't know ultimately what happened, and so it was. But I know that there was some degree of intervention, and then also because the doctor's failure, to make a mandated report, that was a big issue during the course of the trial, and so it sort of shifted a lot of it from the actual offender
to the doctor
and so that was part of the challenge as well, and then also because of the passage of time, although the little girl knew where the lube was, which is
that
something
seems like that would be a slam dunk right there, because why would a 4-year-old know where
right
this...
and I remember she called it the man jelly but she but the layout of some of the things, he had changed some of the things in his room, like there was something about TV, and I just don't remember, like he had a TV and then no longer had the TV or something, but it was it was a trial, so it's like oftentimes all the issues become a little convoluted, and but yeah, and I think that was the first time the defense also tried to present that the little girl was suggestive. That happens with these types of cases where you have these littles, and sometimes that's the defense that comes up. Like, well, she was, coming on to me. I'm
At
sorry.
4 years old.
I'm sorry.
That's what the defense tried to say?
And so I remember learning the laws, the protective laws, where the defense can't do that type of line of questioning absent a specific order of the court. So I remember that was one of the first times I filed that motion to protect the child in that regard. But who would think, right? For
Who
a
would
4 or
even try
5-year-old.
to argue that?
So I remember that issue for that particular trial as well. Mm-hmm.
Wow. I can't imagine trying to be the defense attorney in that situation. Not to pass judgment on him, I get that, well, I'm not going to pretend to know how he felt in that moment or do that, but, that must, how do you stand up for this person and say, nope, they didn't do this, and then make the suggestion that, it was the 4-year-old's fault that she was trying to come onto this 17-year-old. What is the line of thinking with that? I think, obviously, everyone should have an attorney, but, hearing that is just...
Yeah, it's an important protection of our rights.
Especially
if
you're innocent in a different situation, right? Everybody should have an attorney because that's your best bet to protect yourself, but wow.
But, it's tough. It's tough and there are some, and this was a private attorney, and I'm not going to name names, but, and there are some private, defense attorneys who they won't take those types of cases for those reasons. But it's important that somebody does.
Yeah. So, somebody has to, right? Yeah. But it's just, I would not want to be that person. Yeah, that would be hard to separate how you feel personally from defending your client, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure that's a big challenge. So.
Wow. I can't imagine that case is ever going to not stick with you. That you'll just carry that for, not because of anything you did, but just the case. Just hearing that, I feel like that's going to stick with me now for...
Yeah. Another one that has stuck with me, I hope I'm not going to traumatize you now. But...
No, I think it's important that people hear that.
But a little boy who, the family home was kind of out in the woods, and sort of, from a lot of perspectives, kind of living the dream rural life, and that little boy disclosed that his older siblings had sexually molested him, and he wasn't believed by his care providers. It was a mom and stepdad, and to the extent that he ultimately ended up in foster care himself. And I remember one of the things that had happened was the stepfather had told the little boy that if he didn't stop his lying, he was going to be taking him to Alaska and leave him in the forest. And it was this very detailed, explanation for what was going to happen to this child. So he, I remember his first name, but I want to protect his confidentiality. But so I'll call him Little E. So Little E was completely removed. He lost his brothers, he lost his mom, he lost, his stepdad, his home, put into foster care, interviewed, went through the whole process, and we went to trial on it. And the brothers, they testified as well. And but at the end of that particular trial, after the little boy testified about what had happened to him, and he was consistent with what he had shared, previously during the cast forensic interview, he then the court, that was a court trial as well, and the court found that it was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Also, a different private defense attorney, representing the perpetrator in that case. And what was, I thought, particularly remarkable is after the court made his finding of truth as to the abuse having happened, the the case was scheduled for, sentencing. It was called disposition, but the defense attorney let us know that the two boys that had testified against the victim had some words for the court, and they apologized for lying, which that was pretty cool, full circle too. That little boy was, he was heard and he was supported, and at the end of the day, he had his justice, despite the fact that everyone in his life that should have been protecting him, failed to do so. And so that was, I'll remember little E too.
Is that pretty common in those juvenile sexual assault cases where the parents almost try to cover it up? Or not cover it up, but try to sweep it under the rug and play it off as, oh, that didn't really happen, you're just imagining it. Because I've heard that in my personal life from friends as I've grown up hearing these cases of things that have happened, and it just kind of gets not ignored, but like, oh, we don't talk about that like that.
Yeah, it's a really uncomfortable thing to accept. You know, and here, oftentimes it's within the family home, and conflicting interests, and I think strangely maybe denial, feels to the parents or care providers as the safer choice, and they don't really know what happened. But I see both, of course, and we have had some where the parents are protective. Now I'm thinking of an entirely different case where a little girl was sexually assaulted by her older brother, and the mom learned of it, and she also was she has her own life challenges. So she has, a history of addiction. She was sexually abused herself, lots of challenges, but nonetheless, she had the strength and fortitude to do the right thing and make the report regarding what had happened to her little girl. And so her son was prosecuted as a juvenile, and he and it was, pretty serious levels of intervention and treatment, and lockdown type treatment that occurred to address his behaviors. As an adult, he reoffended and victimized a little neighbor girl. And at that trial, I brought back the mom from the first victim, and she testified again against her own son, understanding that he needed to be held accountable and that other children were at risk if he wasn't. But that was not an easy thing for her to do by any means, but she stood up and she did it. So, yeah.
Wow, that is a testament for her to be able to do that. I mean, that's horrible. I mean, it's bad enough that it happens to your child, and then to have your child be the one that does it to your other child,
right,
is pretty hard to grasp. And I would imagine even harder to grasp as the parent of those two children.
Right.
How do you find balance in your personal life when you come across cases like that? I mean, I would imagine your work follows you home, or do you maintain boundaries pretty well in that regard? You can kind of tuck it away and say, no, this is work. How do you decompress? How do you not let that swallow you up, I guess?
Yeah, so early on in my career, I had to learn to build better boundaries for myself, I think, because early on I would take some of that home, and it's like, because it was, I couldn't believe the things I was learning, and they were real, and a lot of horrific horror and tragedy and trauma. And so sometimes I felt like, oh, I really need to talk about this. And then I quickly learned, like looking at my husband's face, that this is so unfair to him, and it's really not making me feel any better. And so I learned from that I really needed to not bring that home. Sometimes if I'm in trial, the reality is I do have to physically bring my work home. And, and what I'll try to do in those instances is get up really early in the mornings. And, it's like I do that on my own. I am careful not to, expose my family to much of any of that, and for lots of reasons. But it's not always easy. And as my kids got older, they started to figure out a little bit more about what I do. And I remember my oldest daughter asking me, and we were just outside the courthouse, and so she probably realized, oh, that's where Mom works. And she turned to me and she said, Mom, do some people not appreciate having to go to jail? Like maybe they don't know that it's good for them. She was just like starting to figure out that like perhaps there's, some criminal defendants that might not be so pleased with what Mom asked.
Yeah, don't really want to go to jail.
Yeah. And, and so that was like, oh, okay. She's starting to get a sense of, what I do, and that maybe not everyone in the community is going to be quite so appreciative of that. And that there could be a very real, risk. Right. So I live a very private life previously.
Prior to doing the podcast, you had it. It was going so well, and then you come on here and I ruined it.
But so that was part of it, and and just really, I do love the outdoors, and that helps me a lot. Just like I love going to the beach and having like, I actually haven't had as much, free time, if you will, but, on Sunday it was like, I need to do this, and so that recharges me. And then I think exercise is super,
absolutely
important. And I also, I don't use drugs or alcohol. And I think that's a really important part too, just to maintain my mental and physical health. And so have other healthy outlets, because sadly, a lot of lawyers do actually, end up finding themselves with, some pretty significant substance and abuse issues. And I don't want to go there. So those are just kind of some personal choices that I make, and trying to also model for my family, healthy ways to deal. And yeah.
Did it make you more guarded? I don't know how old your children are, but did it make you more guarded of them going into these cases and hearing about what people are capable of? You almost just want to shut them in the house and say, okay, we're not going anywhere. We're just everybody's homeschooled now. We're staying at home.
Yes, absolutely. And it still does. I mean, they're still, I have 17, 15, and a 12-year-old, all girls. And yeah, I'm a protective mom, but it's also, important for them to be socialized. And, and so they do go to school, and but yeah, I probably have different talks that may be different from what my own parents, had with me. And I'm my parents were a little more cryptic, I guess, my kids knew their body parts. It's like so,
That's good. I think that's important to have healthy communication with your kids and be able to talk to them and have them know that they can always come to you and talk and be open, and nothing's a secret. And if anybody asks you to keep secrets, that's when you come to talk to us. Like, I think that's very healthy. Communication is always a good thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. I think especially working out, that's my go-to, is just working out. I feel like that's a great way, especially just to clear your head of everything. You can just kind of work through it all. And going outdoors is also a great alternative. I'm a big outdoor guy too, so I can empathize with that for sure.
Yeah.
I think that helps. And especially for you, where you kind of need that balance to maintain a clear perspective. I think that's good to hear.
Right. Keeps us grounded.
Yeah. And yeah, you don't want to be that person that slips into the bottle, because it seems like that would be easy to do when you're faced with the gravity of all of this, that you starts with a couple drinks after work, and then some people can't maintain that balance, and you just tip off the edge.
Yeah. Yeah. I just like to keep it real, and I like to have control and know what I'm dealing with. So
Oh, that's good. Um, and so the election is in June.
Right.
And do you have anything that you're setting out to achieve as DA, or you just want to maintain? Because it sounds like you got a clear head. I'm happy to hear what we've talked about because it sounds like you are one of the DAs that's like, no, like I'm doing this because I'm passionate about the work that I'm doing and I want to make an impact and I want to help these people who have been wronged. Is that kind of just your MO going into the DA position? Is just I want to continue this and help make Humboldt County a better place?
Right. So I would, just kind of backing up to, I was good. I had a private life,
Yeah, you're
and,
definitely going to be more in the
um,
public eye now, I would
yeah,
imagine,
definitely
as the
more.
head of the
Hmm.
organization.
And, but I really, once Maggie, decided that she did not want to, run for another, go for another term, then, she asked me if I would consider, running. And much like, counting my convictions, I hadn't really looked at myself that way. And so when I started to do that and look around, it's like, wow, I truly am uniquely qualified to do this job. She also, I've worked as her assistant district attorney, so it's a different role than all the other prosecutors in our office are deputy district attorneys. So as assistant, it's Maggie, then myself. And so if Maggie's not available, then people go to me, And so I work on personnel issues, budget issues, overall administration of the office with Maggie, in addition to running our sexual assault and child abuse
So you've been kind
crimes
of
unit.
almost perfectly groomed for the role,
Right,
kind of step into it, a natural
right.
fit.
Yeah. And so that coupled with, over 20 years of experience within the office, I'm not going to change who I am. And the fact that I am passionate about, serving our community and ensuring that victims' rights are protected, as well as those of, the accused. And so I am not going to change any of that in any way. I think it's important to continue to put a lot of resources in the child abuse and sexual assault crimes. So I'm what's considered a vertical prosecutor. So I have those types of cases from inception to the end. So, sentencing and beyond. And then we have other vertical prosecution units as well. So we have for domestic violence, elder abuse, the drug task force crimes, and then all of our homicide crimes are also prosecuted vertically. So as soon as we're aware of the case, we have a prosecutor that's assigned that will work with the families, from the beginning to
And
the
they
end. So
stick with it throughout the whole
yeah,
process.
and so
Oh,
it's
that's
just
cool.
yeah, it's really really important so that there's consistency as well as you know. I just can't imagine being in the shoes of some of the family members, or loved ones of some of our homicide victims. And so to have the same prosecutor working throughout and on the case is really important, and also working with the investigating agency. So everyone's on the same page and from the beginning to the end. So we really try to maintain that. So those things I will continue to do as well. I think that one of the goals that I have is to have additional, public outreach and to continue to hear the voices of community members across all of Humboldt. And I want to be aware of what are the public safety concerns, issues. Why don't you feel safe here in your neighborhood? What's happening here? What are the problems? What are the police telling you when they respond? Are they, investigating the report? Are they taking reports? Are there, and then the other thing. So I think that's really important. And I want to heighten that opportunity. I might do it in some sort of public forum, like have some sort of town hall type meetings, invite folks to come. I want to go to different communities and speak with people. And so this process of campaigning has really given me a lot of exposure to even more of our public. And it's awesome. It's really cool to actually see all the people that are really invested and care about Humboldt and have different ideas. So I want to hear those, and I want to put as much into action as I can. And I also want to work kind of more on the front end, like you mentioned earlier. Ideally, it's prevent the crime before it actually
Yeah.
happens. And so obviously, I don't know, obviously, but, I think we see on a daily basis, folks sadly that mental health issues, substance abuse, drug issues, sometimes there's, dual diagnosis type, folks that might then,
Be
get
more inclined.
more inclined to engage in conduct, that's going to land them in the criminal justice system. Why it would be much better to address those issues earlier on so that nobody gets hurt, and that maybe we can help them with their underlying issues. And so I'm really interested in being more engaged with service providers. And, I actually had the chance to go to the emergency department the other day and do a tour and sort of see what's happening there, and the number of folks with behavioral mental health issues that are sort of going and they're being left at the emergency room, and that's really not the place for those folks. And so it's in the moment, urgent crises type situation. And so those are things that I really think that it's important for the district attorney to be involved in at the table, even if it's not like statutorily my jurisdiction. I want to kind of be there a part of and to support that and to know what's going on.
Did you have any reservations about running and about stepping into the public eye of everything, just putting your face out there? Did you have any reservations about assuming the position?
Absolutely. Because I am a private person, and, although I'm a trial lawyer and I'm, speaking in public all the time, I'm not speaking about myself. And so, it's very challenging to like try to talk about yourself, when that's, I'd rather not. And so that's just, there's a lot of awkwardness with all of that. And but I feel like I've just gotten a lot of support, and there's been a lot of positivity and people that are really, helping me appreciate who I am, after, 20 years of returning to my home and, just trying to do the best I can for the community. And so because I am doing it for the community, I've kind of had to set aside my little personal fears, and I'm just moving forward because I feel like there really is no other option, and I'm excited about it.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's easy to tell that you're passionate about your job, and it seems like you were excited to take this next step, even though there's a little fear of being in the public. And I understandably so, because I can't imagine everyone that you put away is exactly happy to, like kids were talking about, to be rehabilitated. But I'm excited to see where that goes for you, for sure. I think that, especially in the realm of law and what that entails, I think it's important to have people that are in it for the right reasons and are in it because they want to help and are passionate about doing that help and doing the work behind the scenes. And I think that it's clear to see that stems to you, that you were passionate about it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you have anything else you want to add? Anything? Where can people find you?
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I do have a website, and it's Stacy, Stacey, Eads, EADS, 4DA, and that's a numeric 4.com. So at my website, there's more information about who I am and my guiding principles in terms of, really, for me, it's very important that I continue to be who I am, which is I serve with integrity, and I truly do believe in justice, for all, and ensuring that everyone's rights are well protected, and ensuring that I do my job to protect our public from dangerousness, and I'm very open to providing rehabilitation and opportunity in those situations where it's appropriate, and also hold offenders accountable. Property crime is another big one. We didn't really touch on that. But that's a big issue for folks, and holding repeat offenders accountable. And, sometimes...
Yeah, I would imagine they get released a lot.
Right. And it's a big problem.
Yeah.
People are understandably really fed up, and we've had a lot of changes in our laws in terms of what the potential consequences are for a lot of the theft-related offenses. But nonetheless, I do think it's imperative for law enforcement and the DAs to continue to convey that message of, we will prosecute, you will be held accountable, stop stealing.
Well, yeah, you had those smash and grabs all across the country where they just weren't getting prosecuted, so they'd go and show up in 50, 100 people and just bash windows and take stuff, and
Right.
that's a problem.
Yeah, it's a big problem. And if you're a person who's earning $15 an hour, and it's your window that gets smashed and your things that are stolen, it's a huge problem.
Yeah, a
For
small
your
business owner,
personal,
you're just trying to get by. You didn't. What
yeah,
did you do to deserve that?
right, right. So these have real life impacts, on folks, and so I appreciate that, and I'm absolutely committed to prosecuting those crimes.
I did want to ask, and I'm not exactly familiarized with this case, so, and I don't know if you are either, so feel free to shoot me down. But are you familiar with the Josiah Lawson case at all?
Well, peripherally.
Okay, because I know in looking you up and trying to get a feel for you before we went into this, I knew that was a pretty big knock against Maggie, and I wasn't sure if that was. I haven't done enough research to form an opinion yet on that, and I didn't know if you were adjacent to that case while she was going through that or trying to figure that out at all.
So I have a lot of familiarity with it. I was never assigned to it or immediately directly involved in the prosecution. I know enough to know that it's horribly tragic, and I cannot imagine to be Ms. Lawson and to have lost her son under those circumstances. And I'm aware that, the case was taken to initially when the first suspect was arrested. The case was filed and it went to preliminary hearing, and the judge found that there wasn't enough evidence to proceed, past that point. And so the case was dismissed. And then when there was additional or slightly different evidence that was brought forward, and the case was then taken to the grand jury, and they didn't find that there was enough evidence to proceed. What's really important for the public to understand is that we have one more bite at the apple. So when there's sufficient evidence to take the case to trial, we have to get it beyond the preliminary hearing stage, and then to trial. If there isn't enough evidence and it gets dismissed at the preliminary hearing level again, it's done. It's dead in the water.
Oh, you only have 3 opportunities.
Well, because the grand jury isn't an actual dismissal. So there's only 2 dismissals that can happen, and then it's gone. So you get 1 dismissal, and if it happens again, you're done, right? And so it's preserved. So when there's enough evidence to proceed, and then we can still do that. And I think that's really, really important. So the way that procedurally it was handled in assessing the evidence and bringing it before triers of fact was a protective measure that was done on the guidance and advice of many experts across the state. If elected district attorney, I would, and I haven't done this, but I would review all the evidence myself. I would invite the input of the Attorney General's office, and they're actually reviewing the case, is my understanding, at this point in time. So they might have additional resources or, ways to look at whatever DNA analysis was provided. There have been other, rumors of, evidence that might be out there. There's, if some of that comes forward, and there's sufficient, I would absolutely proceed on the case.
You just have to make sure you're selective so that you don't jump the gun on that.
Exactly. You have to be very, very careful that there's sufficient evidence to do that. And, to hold the murderer accountable.
Yeah. And it's difficult in that situation. And I was talking to somebody about this the other day, is that, all those people that were around, I mean, somebody must have seen, it was a party. So somebody must have seen something, and it's hard to try to get.
Right. And there have been lots of rumors, but until that, if there's that evidence and that information, we can't proceed on hearsay
your hands
and
are
rumors.
Tied.
We have to actually have the admissible evidence to proceed in court. And so it's really tough and completely tragic. And, yeah.
Yeah, I would have. It was just that had been a knock on Maggie, and I wasn't sure if that was warranted because it's hard. I can imagine your job is hard in situations like that where the public wants this done and they have their own preconceptions about how it should be done and how justice should be served and what that looks like. And you're here like, well, we have to go. We have to work within the bounds of the law, and we need certain things so that we can check the boxes to actually get a conviction or get where we need to go with that. And if those two things don't quite line up, I can imagine there would be a little friction with the public.
Yeah, and I think it's important for Ms. Lawson to know that I would be more than happy to meet with her and hear from her and work with her, and I will do that.
Okay. Well, do you have anything else you want to add?
I can't think of a thing.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, we've been talking for a while now. Stacy, I had a great time. I really, really enjoyed talking with you.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah. It was fun. It was great to see your place here.
Thanks. It was a blast. Best of luck on June 7th, and I feel a little more comfortable with the law situation, knowing that you are out there and there are people out there like you that are actually doing it for the right reasons and trying to make an impact. That's always a comforting feeling.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
That makes me feel good to hear.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you.